Welcome to another deep dive. This time it's eroticism.
By Georges Bataille.
That's right. I gotta say, when I first picked this up, uh, I really wasn't sure what to expect, but
It's quite a journey.
it really is. It's not just about,
Sex.
yeah,
Yeah, it's about all these deep, intense aspects of human experience.
right. We're talking about death, desire, the things that,
The things that you don't really talk about.
yeah, exactly, the taboos.
Yeah.
So this is an English translation of Bataille's original work, and we're gonna really do our best to break down some of his complex ideas.
Yeah, and kind of contextualize them.
Yeah, and see how they connect to the bigger picture of his thinking.
Yeah.
So right away, Bataille throws this curveball.
Yeah, he does.
He says that the realm of eroticism is actually the realm of violence and violation.
Right.
How do we even get there?
He starts with death,
Okay.
which is the ultimate act of violence.
Yeah.
You can't get more violent than death. And he argues that death forces us to confront the fragile nature of our individual existence. It's a jarring, disruptive force that reminds us of the continuity of life itself.
So it's like death is this stark reminder that even though our individual story ends, we're still part of something bigger.
Exactly. And he even goes down to the microscopic level and uses the example of these minute organisms that are constantly dying and reproducing. So you have this continuous cycle where individual organisms perish, but life itself goes on.
So death is actually a key part of this whole cycle of creation and destruction.
Right. And this is where he introduces the idea of plethora. It's basically this excess of energy that he sees in both cell division and sexual reproduction. And he argues that this excess energy ultimately leads to death, but it's also the driving force behind the creation of new life.
So plethora, this excess energy, is what fuels both life and death. It's almost like he's saying that death is the price we pay for the exuberance of life itself.
Yeah,
I'm guessing he sees a connection to sexual energy here.
absolutely. He even suggests that sexual climax, that feeling of losing yourself in the moment, has parallels with the experience of death. It's like a temporary dissolution of the self, a glimpse into that state of non-being.
It's like when people say they're dying for someone or use the phrase le petit mort to describe orgasm. It does suggest a connection, however fleeting, to this idea of death.
Precisely. And Bataille doesn't stop there. He goes on to distinguish between physical and emotional eroticism.
Okay, this is where I started to get really intrigued. Break it down for me. What's the difference?
Well, Bataille sees physical eroticism as focused on maintaining the separation between individuals. It's about individual gratification and holding on to that sense of self. Emotional eroticism, on the other hand, has the potential to transcend the physical act.
So emotional eroticism is about a deeper connection, a willingness to be vulnerable and maybe even lose yourself in the other person.
Exactly. It's less about the physical act and more about the emotional and psychological merging that can happen between two people.
And this leads us to one of the most thought-provoking parts of the book, the relationship between love, death, and continuity. He actually says that the union of lovers, especially when it's based on real love, brings up the idea of death. He even has this very intense quote, "Only in the violation through death, if need be, of the individual's solitariness, can there appear that image of the beloved object which in the lover's eyes invests all being with significance."
That's a powerful quote. It makes you think twice about those romantic notions of love, doesn't it? Bataille seems to be suggesting that true connection requires a kind of symbolic death of the ego, a willingness to let go of your individual self to experience a deeper union.
It's almost like saying that to truly love someone, you have to be willing to lose yourself in that love to experience a metaphorical death of your separate self. But doesn't that contradict his point about physical eroticism, wanting to maintain separateness?
It's a bit of a paradox, isn't it? But I think Bataille is trying to get at the complexities of human desire, how we crave both connection and autonomy. And he sees these tensions playing out in all sorts of ways, even in our cultural taboos.
You talk about his ideas about transgression, right? He says taboos aren't just external rules, but reflections of our deepest anxieties, particularly around death and sexuality.
Exactly. He uses burial customs as an example. Think about it. We treat corpses with such care, wrapping them, burying them, creating all these rituals around death. Bataille sees this as a way for the living to distance themselves from their own mortality, from the unsettling reality of death.
So by creating all these rituals and taboos around death, we're trying to control our fear of it to make it less threatening.
Right, and he sees the taboo on sexuality in a similar light. He suggests that it comes from the potential for sexual impulses to disrupt the order and reason necessary for work and social stability.
It's interesting to think about how these seemingly different taboos around death and sexuality might actually be connected by this underlying fear of losing control. of being overwhelmed by these powerful forces within us.
That's a great insight. And this brings us to one of Bataille's most provocative ideas, that there's actually something sacred about transgression.
So he's saying that breaking taboos, while dangerous, can also be a way to access a deeper level of experience, a kind of raw, unmediated connection to something bigger than ourselves.
Precisely. He points to the example of ritual orgies, arguing that while they might appear chaotic and purely physical, they often held symbolic significance beyond mere indulgence. He even talks about the Maenads, those wild followers of Dionysus who engaged in these frenzied rituals that included acts most societies would consider taboo.
Okay, devouring their own children, that's definitely pushing the boundaries of what most people consider acceptable, even in the context of religious ritual.
But for Bataille, these extreme examples illustrate how transgression, even in its darkest forms, can be a way to break through the limitations of our everyday experience and connect with something primal, something beyond the realm of reason and social norms.
So it's like he's saying that there's a kind of raw power, even a spiritual dimension to these acts of transgression, even if they seem shocking or disturbing to us.
Exactly. And this leads us to his discussion of murder, hunting, and war, those acts of violence that have been ritualized throughout human history.
I'm sensing a theme here. Is he saying that violence is inherently sacred?
He's not condoning violence, but he is saying that these acts, especially in ancient societies, were often imbued with religious meaning. He argues that they were connected to the idea of a sacred, animalistic god who existed outside of human morality.
He even suggests that those incredible cave paintings might actually depict the moment of transgression when the animal is killed, highlighting the ambiguity of life and death.
It's a powerful image, and it forces us to reconsider our own assumptions about primitive societies and the role of violence in their worldview.
It definitely makes you think about how our modern understanding of violence has been shaped by our own cultural and historical context.
Absolutely. And speaking of historical context, Bataille has some pretty small opinions about Christianity and its rejection of the sacred nature of transgression.
Right. He specifically calls out the way the crucifixion is framed as a sin committed out of ignorance rather than a deliberate act of transgression. It seems like a small distinction, but I guess it has big implications for how we understand the whole idea of sin and redemption.
Exactly. Bataille argues that this shift in perspective from seeing the crucifixion as a transgression to seeing it as a sin committed out of ignorance has fundamentally changed our understanding of the relationship between the sacred and the profane.
So he's saying that by separating good from evil so definitively, Christianity lost sight of the potential for transgression to be a source of spiritual power, a way to connect with the sacred.
That's a great way to put it, and it leads us to another fascinating aspect of his thinking, the connection between sexual plethora and death.
Wait, we're back to plethora. I thought we covered that earlier.
Well, now Bataille applies this idea of plethora, that excess energy, to both cell division and sexual reproduction. He argues that both involve a buildup of energy that ultimately leads to death, but it's also the force behind the creation of new life. He even uses this powerful quote, "The plethora of the cell ends in creative death, in the solution of the crisis in which appears the continuity of the new beings."
So he's really driving home this point that death is an essential part of the cycle of life. That it's not just an ending, but a necessary step in the process of creation and renewal.
Exactly, and he links this directly to sexual experience, suggesting that orgasm, with its intensity and release of energy, is also a kind of mini-death, a momentary dissolution of the self.
Wow, that's quite a thought. He's basically saying that even in our most ecstatic experiences, we're brushing up against the limits of our individual existence, getting a taste of that state of non-being.
It's a powerful idea, and it makes you wonder, if death is so intertwined with life, with pleasure, with creation itself, why are we so afraid of it?
That's a great question, and one that I think we'll continue to explore as we dive deeper into Bataille's work. Okay, my mind is officially blown. Bataille is making me rethink everything I thought I knew about life, death, and everything in between.
It's a lot to process.
It is. But before we spiral too far down this existential rabbit hole, let's talk about desire itself. Bataille has some interesting things to say about the object of desire and how it relates to eroticism.
Yeah, he really dives into this idea that desire isn't just about the object itself, but about the interplay between revelation and concealment. He uses the example of religious prostitution, where women were both adorned and made visually appealing, but also expected to act coy and unattainable.
It's like the classic playing hard to get strategy. The more elusive something is, the more desirable it becomes.
Exactly. Bataille suggests that this tension between wanting what we can't have is a key component of desire. And it plays out in all sorts of ways, from courtship rituals to fashion trends.
So it's not just about the object itself, but about the whole dance of pursuit and anticipation.
Right. And this leads to another intriguing paradox that Bataille explores, the relationship between beauty and ugliness in eroticism. He even quotes Leonardo da Vinci, who said, "The active coition and the members employed are so ugly that but for the beauty of the faces, the adornments of their partners, and the frantic urge, nature would lose the human race."
Whoa, that's a pretty blunt assessment from Da Vinci. It's funny because we often associate eroticism with beauty, those idealized images we see in art and media.
But Bataille challenges us to look beyond those idealized images and to acknowledge the raw animalistic nature of the sexual act. He's suggesting that there's a kind of inherent ugliness, even a violence to it, that we often try to ignore or disguise.
So it's like he's saying that the beauty we associate with eroticism is actually a way of taming this wild, potentially unsettling force within us.
Exactly. And this tension between beauty and ugliness, between the idealized and the animalistic,